Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of analysis and discussion here on the Game Professor channel. I'm your host, the Game Professor, and today we're going to be talking about sandbox games, and more specifically, after doing a little bit of an overview discussion of the genre or subgenre. That can be something we can get into deeper conversation about. But after that overview, we're going to get into the topic of Stardew Valley specifically as a variety of sandbox game. So to start off, I really just wanted to talk about some of the elements that have come to be associated with sandbox games and really think about the ways that sandbox elements have been utilized in other genres of game and the effect that that's had on games in general. But like I said, to the more general side of sandbox games, let's just think about some of those elements that are utilized within them. One of the big things that you think about with them is obviously the large open expanse. And this can be really thought of in the realm of what you can do in a game generally, like what all possibilities are there. I would say a really good game that demonstrates that is Minecraft, which I will admit I've never played, but I have friends who've played it, and I've gotten a good amount of secondhand information about it from them, and I'm very curious to play it myself, in large part because of that open world of possibility of type of play that you can have with that game. The other element that a lot of people will think about with sandbox games is going to be the exploration element, having an expansive world that you can continue to discover things in. Obviously, you're going to have a lot of open world RPGs that utilize this element of sandbox type games within it. As far as an actual sandbox game, like a true sandbox game that is its purpose, I would say No Man's Sky is probably going to be the best example of that. And again, I've never played No Man's Sky, but I have read about it. I have listened to people talk about it. I do not personally know anybody who's played it as far as I know, but again, I have an idea of it. Definitely a less concrete idea than I do of Minecraft, but I have a picture of it in my mind. I really get this exploratory element from it, this real deep dive into just what this world can produce. And for me, that really, really embodies this open world element of sandbox titles that has been taken up by the likes of the Elder Scrolls, I would say the Assassin's Creed series as well, Grand Theft Auto, really the Rockstar titles in general. I would even make the argument that Bully has some excellent sandbox elements associated with a larger open world. Obviously a smaller world than some of those other titles developed by Rockstar, but still, this element of finding things in the world, this fact that you can not find things and that can potentially influence the gameplay, very interesting to think about. And this is where we kind of get into the bigger thing that I want to talk about and then shift into talking about Stardew Valley, is looking at the impact of the sandbox elements and how they will then merge with narrative elements. Because you think about a sandbox, the idea of a sandbox, whether a literal physical sandbox or a digital synthetic sandbox that you're going to have within the video game arena, you really have this element of endless possibilities. That's really the point that a lot of these games are getting at. When you start to merge it with narrative elements, you suddenly start to put limitations on that sandbox. So this is why when I think about those sandbox elements that I'm talking about, first games that come to mind when I'm trying to think pure sandbox, I go to Minecraft. I go to No Man's Sky. I would even make the argument that a lot of simulation games will tie into those endless possibilities elements, kind of that you're going to get really with both of those games. And it just kind of does it in a more condensed way because you're specifically looking at simulating something. I would say that those, especially the possibilities of things that you can do, the endlessness of the game, really, that you get a lot with Minecraft. The impression I get with No Man's Sky is that there is an end that you're trying to reach because you're trying to find the center of the universe. There really isn't an end in a true simulation game. But back to that insertion of sandbox elements in a narrative game, it has differing elements or differing effects depending on the game. So let's take a look at an Assassin's Creed game. I would argue that every single one of the Assassin's Creed games has a sandbox element to it, and it's done to varying degrees of effectiveness as the series goes on. Now, I will say I have not played every single Assassin's Creed game completely at this point. I'm currently in varying degrees of completion, starting at Black Flag up through Syndicate. So everything in that range I've started, but I have not completed. The last game that I completed was Assassin's Creed 3. And even that, I kind of rushed the storyline a little bit. I will admit I really didn't take full advantage of the sandbox that you have there. So the majority of my experience I'm going to look at really is in Assassin's Creed through Assassin's Creed Revelations, I would say. Now, in terms of the sandbox elements of those games, I would argue that 2 and Brotherhood really are the ones that do the best with it. I think that they merge that exploration of the space and the integration of that with a narrative in the most effective manner. If you look back at the first Assassin's Creed, the open world elements, the reason that you want to explore the kingdom, that you really want to explore every element of each city, is pure fetch quest. And it's very meaningless fetch quest at that. Like, the reason that you are looking for the flags is to help fill in the memory sequence for Desmond as he is completing this in the modern day, going back to his ancestors' timeline. And while completing these DNA sequences creates a completion element of it, there's no stakes within Altair's timeline or really for Desmond at that, because you get through the story without doing that. And the same thing goes for all of the various side quests that you can complete within each city as you are trying to complete the memories and get to the assassinations themselves. Jump ahead to looking at Ezio in Assassin's Creed 2 and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Suddenly you have stakes within Ezio's timeline specifically for completing these fetch quests. In Assassin's Creed 2, getting the feathers, that is a big part of allowing Ezio's mother to recover from her grief. It gives her that element of closure for the deaths of her husband and both her eldest and youngest son. And the same thing with getting all the codex pages. Like, yes, there is this narrative element to it, but you have to do a certain amount of completion within the city. You have to explore enough of the city in order to really make finding the codex pages possible. Then you start looking at the exploration of Monteriggioni in Brotherhood, and you add this element in modern days with Desmond, and he's finding things and filling out the story himself. You can very easily just rush through everything and really learn nothing in the modern day timeline for Desmond by doing that, but by talking to everybody, by exploring Monteriggioni, obviously a very small, very limited sandbox for Desmond, but a sandbox all the same, insofar as it's allowing the exploration and really pushing the narrative as far as it can go for Desmond specifically. Now, go in a completely different direction with the insertion of a sandbox in the world of a narrative game. You have the open world RPG. So games that I've played that I'm thinking about with this, I'm mostly thinking of the Elder Scrolls games, though I would argue that BioWare games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect, those series, would also fall into this. Looking at these sandbox elements in something like a Skyrim or an Oblivion, you can not touch the storyline at all, the main storyline. You can completely ignore it and do everything else in that world and be playing for dozens to hundreds of hours, depending on your ability, and you can have a grand old time just doing that. You can do so much in these games without worrying about the storyline, and yet there is still this central storyline here that has varying degrees of impact on the world around it with the other side quests, depending on how you play. That really creates this very holistic way of playing, very individual way of playing, and that really ties in very well with the idea of the sandbox environment and the sandbox game in general. Now, turning to Stardew. Is this a sandbox game? I would argue yes. I would say that this is a sandbox game that falls into the category of having a main narrative, and you can influence the main narrative kind of just by naturally playing through the game, but you really don't have to care about that narrative at all. I would say that it is even less significant, the main narrative, should you want to play this game, than the main narrative in an Oblivion or in a Skyrim is. And I find that really interesting, and I think that it really brings to mind a lot of questions of why do we play these games? Why are we interested in playing these games? Because if you really get into the game element, the play element, to get a bit academic with it, the ludic elements, I don't think that I defined this term in any of my previous videos, but ludology is the play and game focused view of video games. It essentially argues that a game is a game because it is a play-based object, and it is only the play element of it that makes it significant. Anything else, narrative, music, whatever, does not matter in making it significant as a game. I do not wholly buy into that. I also do not wholly buy into the idea of narrative making a game significant. Instead, I say that it is this blending of these elements that makes a game significant and meaningful. And one of the big elements that you have with ludology is that it suggests that there has to be a win parameter for it to be a game. With a sandbox game, where's the win parameter? Like I said, with going back to some of the kind of prime examples, No Man's Sky. What's the win parameter? The whole point of playing that game is exploring the universe, and I guess the win parameter would be reaching the center. Since I've never played it, I don't know. Same thing with Minecraft. The win parameter comes from the storyline. And you really do not have to go into the storyline in Minecraft at all. So with something like Stardew Valley, in a lot of ways, the win parameter, if you want to call it that, is kind of thrust upon you no matter what, and that is Grandpa's evaluation. Now, obviously, we're still a very long way away from Grandpa's evaluation in Stardew. I still haven't even found the letter informing us of the impending evaluation that will happen. Not in everything that I've recorded thus far, we still haven't gotten that, so apologize for the spoiler, but there is a shrine on the farm, and we will find a letter there from Grandpa saying that he's going to judge the farm at a specific time. Now, this win parameter, this impending judgment is thrust upon us. In the same way, arguably, the idea of fixing up the town, whether it be through the community center or the Joja Mart, I'm just going to call it the Joja method. Either of those, this process of fixing up the town really is also another win parameter. The idea of leveling up your farm or your farmhouse completely, that is a bit of a win parameter. Reaching the bottom of the mines, that's a win parameter. Leveling up your skills, that's a win parameter. You really have a lot of different win parameters in Stardew Valley, but yet you always have this narrative one kind of lording over you, I'd say. And I don't know how to really contend with that in regard to the kind of lack of win parameters that are often existent in a lot of sandbox games. If you think about the sandbox elements in an Assassin's Creed game, really, it's like, okay, I'm completing something. That is the win parameter, but it's still not the most significant element of it, and really, in a lot of ways, the fleshing out of the world is kind of the win parameter within it. I would also say that that's kind of the case in the Mass Effect series, the learning more about the world, the filling out of the codex, as it were. That is kind of the win parameter there. And certainly in Mass Effect 3, there really is this impending doom element to it, because everything that you do influences your galactic readiness. And ultimately, your galactic readiness influences the ending that you receive or the options for endings that you can receive. So the ways that the sandbox elements will influence this win parameter that is part of what makes games gamey, if you believe that, I don't entirely know how to contend with that. Because again, you look at a lot of sandbox games, in a lot of ways, the win parameters become player created. I think about something like The Sims, which, given that it's a simulator, I really do believe that it is a variety of sandbox games because of the possibilities that are available and the pushing of the boundaries of game you have there. Well, what do a lot of people do with The Sims? They do challenge playthroughs. There are very specific rules to challenges, and they're fascinating because it is entirely player created. And you do see a lot of that with Stardew Valley as well, whether it's completing the community center year one, racing to reach 1 million gold, completing the collections, whether it's the fish, the crops, the museum artifact and gem collections. These are player created challenges that get put into play, and that really becomes a big element of sandbox games for me, except when the sandbox elements really can influence the narrative. And Stardew is kind of this weird middle place with it because, like I said, you have all these challenges that are player created and really can be the impetus behind a lot of starting of playthroughs, but you also have this narrative element of grandpa, of fixing the town, of building a functional farm that allow for this long standing playthrough that really is indicative of this sandbox element, but at the same time so indicative of the in-game storyline. So I'm really curious to hear what you all have to say in regard to this, because I think Stardew as a sandbox game and the way that it kind of ties both into the sim side of things, given that it is a simulator at its core, but also tying into some of the RPG elements because it's also an RPG. So it's let me know down in the comments, down or on the Discord, in the Facebook group, wherever. Please let me know what you think. This is a fascinating game in regard to the type of sandbox that it is, and I want to know what people think. As a player, I have always been so focused on storyline with it. I often have left farms and not gone back to them once I'm past endgame, and I'm actively trying to not do that with one of my latest playthroughs, the one that I've mentioned now a couple of times, I believe, in my commentary. I right now I just completed the community center in that playthrough. I'm in endgame. I'm working on getting the missing bundle. I still haven't gotten all of the wizard endgame stuff at this point, but I'm really trying to build a functional farm that I can kind of continue to go back to just for like a relaxing time on the farm. But I've never done this before. Like I've completed the community center. I've been married. I've upgraded everything completely. And it's like, okay, I'm done. I did everything I need to do. And a lot of that ties into the narrative. But really, when it comes down to it, because Stardew is a type of sandbox game, it really should be something that can be gone back to whenever, and you do whatever you want with it. And I don't know if I am typical in the fact that I usually will end up leaving a farm after a time, after I've completed everything, or if I'm weird in that sense. So if any of you are Stardew players, let me know what your take on that is. Do you really buy into the real deep sandbox elements of it, or do you kind of focus more on the narrative elements, and the sandbox elements really just are part of what makes the narrative more interesting for you? I think that because of the nature of the narrative of Stardew, it's kind of in a weird place within the sandbox universe, as it were. I think that's everything from me for today. I think that I covered everything. I'm kind of digging into the informal nature of these videos, so if I forget things or if I only gloss over things that you want to hear more about, let me know down in the comments or on Discord or Facebook, because if there's something that you want me to dig more deeply into, I want to do that, because ultimately this is all a learning experience for me as well. I want to broaden the knowledge of gaming and games to really make games a more meaningful and important thing for the world at large, because games are important and meaningful. So thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this discussion. Always leave comments down below or on Discord. I'm eager to hear from you, and I will see you next time.